We're going to be looking at it from a business perspective and security perspective, both from a US side of the pond, if you will, and also for our European side. Today we've got Bob West, who was just presented. And then in addition to Bob, we have Frank Schlottke on this end, nearest to me. He is the CEO of Applied Security. He has won the award for the longest travel to come to GrrCON this year. He came from Frankfurt, Germany. And, and Frank has been in the information security industry a long time. He used to do and still does a lot of technical information, so he does have that engineering background, and one of his interests is Latin, so you have to ask him about some of our product line names because it's got some interesting twists to it. I won't introduce Bob West again because that would be boring. On the end is Joe Schorr. He is the practice manager for the security industry for CBI, Creative Breakthroughs, a consulting firm out of Detroit. He previously spent 3 years as a managing consultant for the British ethical hacking team. British Telecom. Okay, thank you. I'm not very good at this. So anyway, without further ado, what we're going to do here is Bob's going to start and talk about the cloud, give about a 2-minute kind of background into the business side of the cloud and why it's gotten all the talk. And then either Joe or Frank will go next and talk about the security issues and the big things that need to be addressed from the EU perspective. And then Joe will talk about it from the US and kind of from the GRC side of it. And then I've got a couple of front-loaded questions, and then I'll be walking around, so if you got any questions you'd like to talk about, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. So without further ado, go ahead, Bob.
So I like to say that the cloud is the latest ready, fire, aim exercise since offshore outsourcing about 10 to 15 years ago, right? Where you have people that you know that there's perceived business value, and there is business value. People are rushing to the cloud, but don't necessarily understand A, how to get there, and B, how to keep it secure. But from a basic business value perspective, you think of implementing a CRM application or an ERP application. For a large corporation, you're talking a couple of years in terms of a timeline to implement. You're probably talking 9 figures in terms of implementation cost. And when you're there, then so what does it take for me to manage that environment? What does it cost me to do a rev upgrade? So in the legacy Siebel world, which is now Oracle's CRM solution, for a large organization, it's probably somewhere 5 to 10 million just to get to the next rev of software, right? Or plan B is I could implement something like Salesforce.com, who is the 800-pound gorilla in the cloud right now, and they know it. And around that in the last couple days, so they're very modest as a consequence. And they'll tell you about it too. But so I can implement Salesforce.com. I mean, literally have a global CRM solution, maybe not quite overnight, but pretty darn close. And you can have it if there's no customization required. You can do some, but I skipped the 2-year implementation cost. I don't have to manage the infrastructure. And then there's the environmental concerns in terms of data center costs, et cetera. And as a large corporation, I probably have some sort of environmental or green initiative going. So if I'm reducing the number of servers I have, the electrical cost, my general footprint, it really aligns from a business perspective. The question then becomes, am I thinking about implementing the cloud strategically? Who's next?
So I'm here to add the European perspective and talk a little bit about how Europe or the European Union is seeing the protection of personal data and how this relates to the cloud initiatives. It means, like you just mentioned, Salesforce.com. They are almost invisible in Europe. Nobody is using them, almost nobody, sorry. Why is this the case? So the protection of personal data is a very high value in Europe, and it's coming with the EU directive that says that the processing of personal data is not allowed except for specific reason. And if you do so, you have to be very transparent, you have to process data proportionally, so only the data you require, and you have to do it with a purpose, and you have to make this very clear. So this means personal data, and personal data is everything that can be used to identify a natural person, is a very high value. So a lot of obstacles are laid in the way, and also the place where the personal data is stored is regulated. So as an example, tax data in Germany, tax data that the tax authorities may want to see has to be physically in the European Union. So if you use cloud technology, where is your data? Do you know it? Can you prove it? You're legally responsible for this data. So how do you address this issue? And that's what is people moving in Germany, in Europe, in the European Union, apart from the whole Greece thing.
So Bob touched on this in his speech just a second ago about this rush to go to the cloud. So I have a kind of a theory about that. How many, show of hands, how many people here already have, are undergoing, or about to undergo a move to cloud computing in some way, shape, or form? Okay, keep your hands up. So how many of those initiatives have to do with something like sales or marketing or sales automation? How good are your salespeople and your marketing departments at information security? Are they pretty good at it, right? Yeah. So if you're rushing to the cloud, I really wonder sometimes what the motivations are to rush to it, and I kind of understand it, but I wonder sometimes how much of it has to do with people that have no clue about information security wanting to do business better, and sales runs companies. The other part of it I wonder is how many companies are doing it because it's safer. And at first I thought, well, that's good. If they don't do information security well, that's great. Go to the cloud. You know, it's probably better. You touched on this too. It's probably better than what you're doing in your shop. But if you feel that impulse to go to the cloud just because it's safer than the way you do things, then there's probably enormous gaps in the rest of your security model. And the big thing for me it's always come down to is just the endpoint. So it's pretty cool if you got all your salespeople running up and doing all this stuff and they can hit Salesforce.com and all, but what the heck, what does their daily routine look like? This, you know, non-savvy group of people that are running around with the keys to your kingdom. So I think it still kind of comes down to, it's always the endpoint. I mean, what was the biggest, most sophisticated attack this year? Or actually the past year or so? Stuxnet, right? Stuxnet boiled down to, with, you know, stolen certificates were really cool. There was multiple 0 days. There were 2 different development groups in multiple countries. This thing was a big nation-driven effort. And it boiled down to what I suspect was probably a relatively poorly paid Russian guy that worked for Rosatom, living in some village in Iran, pouring concrete or something for this new atomic plant, getting a USB key and walking in and jamming that in a Siemens system someplace, or something that had access to a Siemens system. So it always, to me, kind of boils down to the endpoint, and whether it's, you know, that endpoint is part of that personal information network that's being fed up there. So I think that the whole key to this is not, if you're going to rush, then okay, rush, but you better have a plan in place for all those users.
So then you've got the issues like Sony's multiple breaches, right, where the PlayStation network was down for, what was it, 3 months or so? You know, what's the business impact to Sony, right, when their PlayStation network is down? I mean, you think of the number of people that have PlayStations that are probably going to Wii's or Xboxes or whatever it is. And then there are all the multiple lawsuits. There was one in Canada for $1 billion, and the settlement probably wasn't $1 billion. It was maybe 100 or a couple $100 million. But it's still writing a pretty big check. But the big thing from a business perspective is, you know, what's my lost revenue? You know, how many PlayStation 3s am I not selling, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you know, what's the amount of money I'm spending in court?
Sorry, I always have to wait for it to turn on. Okay, so obviously there's a business need to go there, and then you've always got this natural tug of war, if you will, between the business side saying, well, we want to go to the cloud because of the cost savings, or you got a sales rep that uses a credit card and opens up a Salesforce.com account, and all of a sudden you've got kind of a movement there. So Bob, here's a softball question for you. So kind of map out, you talked a little bit about it in your intro, but what kind of cost factors are businesses saving by going to the cloud and the different aspects of that?
Yeah. So again, going back to if it costs me $100 million to implement a CRM or ERP application versus spending $5 to $10 million on a run rate basis to have an application. I mean, just right there, that's an order of magnitude savings. But that doesn't include the cost to manage the application, the cost to get an additional rev. So in most cases, you're literally talking an order of magnitude savings, if not more. And that's pretty significant financial benefit for an organization, particularly with organizations that have low profit margins. So you think of a Walmart or Cardinal Health that has very thin profit margins. If I can save myself $100 million from a large implementation, and I probably have 3 or 4 applications that fit that profile, that's a pretty substantial savings to the bottom line.
Sure, sorry, I'm waiting for this to turn on again. If anybody wants to answer a question, just raise your hand. So obviously there's a business need there. Sorry, somebody raise your phone. Okay, hang on, I'll get the mic over here.
I don't want to sidetrack it too much, but we've got
sidetrack away.
A knowledge management, talent inventory, so to speak, of the people resources that an organization has. And the organization is global. And the department wants to deploy this knowledge management system with people's resumes, personal information. And I'm curious what the requirements are. I was interested to hear you talk about storage and that the storage has to be in Europe. And if we deploy a system like this here locally, with a system integrator that's here in the U.S., what responsibilities do I have as the security person that's coming in to do a review or an evaluation on the setup and make recommendations? What are some of the controls I should look for, and what are some of the requirements that we would have? Again, the staff that would use this are globally around, so we've got people in Europe, people in Asia, people in the United States, but we're looking at sharing their talents with each other, kind of like the Match.com, but instead of for dating, it's for internally hooking up people, if we're looking for specific skill sets within the organization.
Well, I'm no lawyer, so all I'm saying is from the experience I'm having with the European laws and for the work we've done for different organizations here. So when you do that, of course, at least that's what the most of the laws in the European Union say. You have to make to your employees totally transparent where their data is, how you do protect it. You have to tell them, like in Germany there's a law, you have to tell everybody totally what you store about him, where it is. There is an agreement, a mutual agreement between separate countries in Europe and the US about how data can be transferred, but this is not on a EU-wide basis. So you should check with your counselors on what you can do and what you can't do. This is definitely personal data you're saving here. The business need is clear, yes, but nevertheless you should check there. It's not that easy.
Frank, I think this also works into, I don't know how many of you saw this, but about 2 or 3 months ago, the chairman of the EU, in several articles, and one was in the New York Times, had a scathing, tear down with Microsoft because they must somewhere somebody's using Microsoft in the cloud, and the whole thing was Microsoft had to come out and say, well, You know, the US Patriot Act says, I got to give up your data, and if the data is residing here in the US, this is a data residency issue, is what it's referred to, I'm going to give up your data. Well, that is in stark contrast to the EU privacy laws that you're talking about. So, talk a little bit, there's a question here, but kind of let's backward and let's go to this question, but kind of think about that and what the implications of that as far as cloud adoption, and not only for companies in the EU, but also from the standpoint of, I'm a multinational company here in the US and I've got employees in the EU. But let's go to this question.
I'd add to that, how does that impact your safe harbor program then through the FTC? So my question is a little bit higher level in the sense of, if I'm evaluating cloud solutions, you know, there's certain criteria you might use to evaluate a product if you're buying it. We're looking to establish principles to work with our business on to say, is the cloud good fit or not? Not if cloud is bad or evil or anything like that. So is there anything unique about that? I mean, you worry about performance, you worry about connectivity, you worry about you know, how well they protect your data with a survey, you worry about terms and conditions and intellectual property protection. I mean, is there anything really unique about the cloud as far as evaluating the solution for a business fit?
So, I mean, just generally speaking, the process for looking at a cloud provider, in my mind, is not that different than an outsourcing company like a CSC or an IBM. And the basic principles hold true with them as well. So, you know, what are the basic controls that I have in terms of protecting information? You know, what does my contract look like? You know, so if I'm a regulated company, it doesn't matter where my information sits. I have to comply with my regulatory requirements. So from a contractual perspective, you need to put some language in there that says, you know, A, you'll comply with my policies and standards, and here's what I need to do from a basic business perspective to protect my information. The Cloud Security Alliance has a cloud controls matrix. I think it's cloudsecurityalliance.org, if I remember right. If you look at the cloud control matrix, there's a good questionnaire there. But someone like Salesforce.com, as an example, is ISO 27000. I think it's 27001 certified. So that gives you an indication in terms of how well they do. The flip side is, and they actually do a pretty good job, but the information by default at Salesforce is stored in the clear, which then goes back to the issues that Frank was talking about in terms of data sovereignty, you know, fundamental regulatory issues. So you know, Nirvana says that you know, as you're approaching cloud strategy, that you're encrypting it, you hold on to the keys as an organization. You know, there's multiple things that you need to be considering as you're moving to a cloud provider. You want to say anything?
Yeah. Kind of to echo what Bob said, I mean, I would look at the simple stuff, that what kind of controls they use, you know, SAS 70 or the ISO models. They need to have a really mature, or multiple mature security governance models in place, and they need to be audited regularly and show you evidence of being audited regularly and who and how often is doing that. If they're going to be taking on that much risk, one would assume that they're already doing those things, but you really can't assume it these days. I mean, cloud's hot, so you're going to get a lot of new players to it. And again, it's the same thing. I think one of the big things I always keep an eye on is encryption with it. And obviously, moving to that model, you're going to need fast encryption. It's not going to interfere with availability or cost of doing business. So if they've got a mature controls model, they're encrypting what you want encrypted, because not everything has to be. I don't care if my name's encrypted or not, but if you've got those crown jewels that every company has, they've got to have a solid, proven, repeatable plan in place to protect your stuff, just like you would do.
Okay, next question.
So you mentioned the Cloud Security Alliance, and they've got like their vendor questionnaire of like 150 questions that covers security and DR and financial viability and all sorts of things. My question is really, how's, with these industry cloud standards, you know, these industry groups like Cloud Security Alliance, how's the adoption rate? Are vendors and enterprises actually adopting this, or are they still kind of inventing it themselves?
So are you asking, are they adopting controls like the cloud controls matrix that the Cloud Security Alliance does? I'd say that there's a lot of large organizations that are using that model. I think that a lot of organizations use ISO 27000 as a measuring stick. Going back to, can you really trust an organization to do the right thing? And in my mind, it's trust but verify. I mean, you've got to be able to go in and audit the organization. And Amazon is actually countercultural in that model, which kind of surprises me. But they say that their technology is their secret sauce. But at the end of the day, if I had something strategic and I didn't have the ability to inspect what was under the covers, that might be a concern.
Next question.
Can you help better define private cloud, what is really meant, how people are implementing private cloud, and how some of these issues that we've talked about change with private cloud?
I would define it as a cluster. I'm not a fan.
The most common way I've heard people describe private cloud, other than a cluster, and pick your favorite cluster. It's typically virtualized environments. So I may have a VM farm that I have within my facility. So that's what I typically see as a definition of a private cloud. So I have a whole bunch of servers that have 15% utilization. So do I have 2,000 servers, or do I have a VM farm that optimizes and makes me as an organization more efficient? I mean, that's the basic value proposition behind virtualizing environments.
Frank, going back to, I'm going to circle back around. So Joe brought up encryption. So let's go back to the EU privacy laws and kind of the data residency issues. If the data is encrypted in the cloud, does that help meet some of those issues with that Lloyd came up with, as far as, okay, we've got this private data, does it really matter where it resides if it is encrypted?
Well, it definitely helps. It's a prerequisite. The EU directive has 7 principles. It follows. It's principles like notice. You have to notify the one that whose data you're processing, that this data is processed. You have to give him access to that. You have to disclose who is processing this data. You have to have a purpose for doing so and explain it. And you have to be accountable for processing this data. And one of these principles is security. You have to secure the data you're processing, the personal information, the personal data, and encryption is one way to protect this data. So if you're offering cloud services, you do a good job if you encrypt this data, and you do even a better job if you encrypt this data and give these keys to the kingdom to the customer that is actually using your service. Because then you can say, I can't access this data, it's only the customer that's doing. I can do the backup, but I can read what actual data is there in the cloud, or in specific fields. You mentioned it, I don't care if somebody knows my surname, but maybe I do care if somebody knows my health records and what prescriptions I got the last year. So that does probably matter to me. Generally, I think Europeans are probably a little bit more sensible to this whole issue because of our past, of the bad experiences that, especially, I'm from Germany, so especially, and that came up in the time of World War II. So it's very, like you are doing this on a global scale, you have to be very careful with what you're doing. There are a lot of cases that go to court regarding that issue, and most of the times the personal rights are protected.
Okay, thanks.
I just wanted to go back. There was a gentleman that was asking the definition of what's private cloud. And I think there's a lot of people that the definition is nebulous, pun intended. But if you go to NIST.gov, there's a presentation that Tim Grants and I want to say Ron Ross put together about a year ago. It's really, really good in terms of giving basic definition of what's a private cloud, what's a public cloud, what's a hybrid cloud, what's a community of interest cloud. And I think that's a really good level set in terms of doing one. There's also Vivek Kundra, who used to be the federal CIO at the White House, put together a federal cloud strategy. And if you go to whitehouse.gov, the federal cloud strategy is up there. And it has some more good definition, but also some good strategy in terms of cloud adoption.
Question?
So by your definition, anytime data is processed, you're supposed to notify a person about the data being processed. So does that mean every time I run a backup of my data on Saturday night, I need to send an email out to all 10 million people that are in my data set saying, I backed up your data tonight?
You should probably notify before processing the data.
Oh, okay.
No, meaning something, okay, once you enter your data here in this database or whatever,
right,
we will process your data according to our data processing policies, and you can find these policies here. Once you put the data in, you accept the terms and conditions that come with it. So he's notified. But what the right he has in Europe is to ask you anytime, free of charge, to give all the information you stored about him to you.
Okay, so the terms are on your website. You tell them to agree to those terms.
Yeah.
Of this is how we work with your data. If they ask for the data at any time, you need to be able to give it to them.
There are a lot of clever lawyers around that make a fortune of money by finding the right legal terms here.
Okay.
We've got to wrap up here, so one last thought that came to my mind. We kind of talked about the data residency of companies storing data in the U.S., but we have a lot of manufacturers here in Western Michigan that are doing business all over the world. I know that there's ITAR issues also with the cloud, which is international trade, something I'm not very good at these. Joe, can you speak to, real briefly, kind of wrap up with that, and then we'll be done? Or Bob, whoever, because obviously, having data out in the cloud that's being regulated as far as being exported could be critical.
So I think the question is, I'm an American manufacturer, I'm doing business globally. What is it that I need to care about in terms of where do I store the information? Is that the question, Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to understanding, where am I storing it? What are the regulations within that country? Do they have the right to inspect the information? It's, where am I doing business? What are the local regulations? What are my regulations as an entity? Do I have regulatory requirements as a business that say thou shalt do X, Y, and Z? A lot of it goes back to doing what's commercially reasonable and protecting information. But it goes back to, fundamentally, if you're doing cloud computing, where does my information actually reside? So I may have a primary data center in San Jose as Salesforce, but I may have real-time replication somewhere else in the world. So fundamentally understanding where is my information, and given where it is, what do I need to do?
I think there's going to be some model that comes up at some point, almost like the hybrid private-public cloud thing. That's probably where the biggest risk is going to be when we're trying to meld those together. But I think the opportunity with the international stuff is going to be some sort of federated partitioning scheme that somehow you can segregate what's classified, to use the word classified, secret way, and federating that, having some sort of clearinghouse or agreement in between.
Yeah, so one last thought. I mean, Salesforce is an example. U.S. government business is important to them. So they've stood up a data center in Metro DC that's FISMA modern compliant. So the question becomes, how much money do I really want to spend to get business? And if I'm partitioning things, ultimately there's a cost. So what do I want to pay for it?
Okay, thank you guys. And thank you for letting us wrap up there. Let's give it a right hand.
Oh my God, I'm choking. No. How are you guys doing? Quick round of hands. How many people in here have either a log management tool or a SIM tool in-house already? or using some kind of central log management. Okay, great. So, I know you guys do. So what I wanted to talk about, I'm with ArcSight, we're a SIM vendor, and about 2 years ago, we realized that with this powerful correlation tool, one of the key things that was missing is the ability to use identity information. When I talk about identity information, I'm not talking about the user ID that maybe a Windows login might have, but actually the attributes in an IDM system, in Active Directory. So the basic talk is user tracking, combining logs with identity information to make those logs richer and easier to use. I don't know if you guys can see it back there, I should use black, but traditional SIMs, you would have events, you would have scan data from vulnerability scanners, location information, asset information, and then at the end of the day, you have this IP-based tracking system with a lot of enriched data. You know, what vulnerabilities are on there, what kind of asset is it, it's critical to be able to use the correlation. Where we've kind of taken it is to say, well, if we were to add the identity information that's not in the logs, it would make it a lot better for the end user. So now taking the events, still having the traditional SIM data, but now using attributes from your AD or your IDM solution. Being able to bring in the roles and access rights you have in there, and to give you a bigger picture of what's going on in your environment. So if we take a look at this, important attributes are not in the logs. So when you get a Windows Active Directory log event, what's missing is the attributes from your AD in those logs. So how do we get that in there? So when I talk about attributes, I'm talking about the distinguished names. I'm talking about maybe if you have your manager information in there, phone number, full name, and the roles they belong to. So what we're doing right now is doing what's called a model import connector. Tying into your AD, tying into your IDM system, actually pulling those attributes and using that with the log information. So let's take a look. SQL Plus login, you've got, attacker address, port information. That's great in itself. If you have it in a correlation, you can use it with other logs. But using the attributes, you can now say his role as a consultant, his status is inactive inside AD, so now you know it's a deactivated ID. His identity is Morris Hicks, his full name is Morris Hicks, and his manager is John Doe. Taking that simple log and having this context, and now being able to use that in correlation rules is pretty powerful. A couple of things you want to see is, we've taken that information, we correlate an IP with a user, we identify the associated username, enrich the event with the user data, and those are some of the key advantages. So a person in your environment might have multiple identifiers. It could be R. Jackson, his badge number, an email, a separate ID, his database ID. With identity correlation, you can kind of tie that back to the individual users. If you had a log just with a badge number from your physical device, how much work would it be to figure out who that user actually is? Because that's not typically in the log. By doing what we call session tracking of the user, we can keep that correlated with the user himself. Some of the standard content from a bookkeeping perspective, just with the basic information, your AD user or your IDM system can now get, who are my people with privileged accounts? When were they last added and taken away very quickly? So you can see if someone escalated their privileges and took it away, getting a correlated alert on that. But also here, how many IDs do you have? How many are disabled? How many are enabled? This has nothing to do with correlation. This is just metrics, first of all. After that, you can now do some key use cases. For example, privileged account activity. We have Sam Malone as the identity, but you notice he's got multiple IDs in there. And a couple of them are root or privileged accounts. And you're probably asking, well, how do you tie a root ID back to the individual user? Because that's not in the log. If someone logs in as root, how do you know that's Sam Malone? Let me take you through a couple of steps. When the user logs in, he gets a DHCP address. What a typical system will do is keep that log. What we're doing is basically saying, let's track that. So Sam Malone got a DHCP, he logged in, his ID is M Malone. We're going to keep that, we're going to say his session's still open. Now from there, if he SSHs to another box and we're getting the Unix login, we know where he came in from. So we're associating root back to that original DHCP lease, tying that back to the user, keeping a session tracking, and then we can report on it. Does that make sense from what we're doing? So the key thing to understand here is, from a correlation system, you need to have a place to keep this information. what we call an active list or some type of list. But then there's also it needs to be dynamic. It needs to be able to be updated and removed by a rule or conditions without you having to do any intervention. The other key thing is there has to be a session list where sessions are being closed and off and you're keeping track of it very highly. And it needs to be in memory for the processing to happen. So it's all kept static in a database, but loaded in memory for high processing.
If that one drops off.
The next thing is, here's one of the reports you can get. You see the full username, but all the products that they've logged into and the individual log lines and how many times it's happened. These are the kind of reports and data you can get if you combine identity information. This is actually from a customer, so I had to gray out a couple. But notice we're using user and department risk level. Now the key thing to understand is, if your AD just has the standard attributes, we can use that. But if your AD has attributes above that, where it's department, where it's contractor roles, then you can get dashboards like this fairly simple. At the top here, you have top blocked identities. So they're using proxy logs, which have standard IDs or anonymous proxy outbound, but correlating that back to sessions to say, okay, the last person who had this IP was Jim that went through the proxy. His full name is X. Now you can actually get relative information on where people are going through your proxy servers. The other key thing is over top block departments. Taking your AD system, associating the user that went through the proxy, and saying, okay, what department do they belong to? One of the key things they used is to see, who's using the most bandwidth, what department's using the most bandwidth by tying ID information back to flow data as well. So just a couple of examples of how you can use identity information for metrics. One of the key things we have out of the box is basically threat scores. We have standard high-level threat scores on things like who changed a privileged account, is this person a contractor, has he been put on a disgruntled link list, is he going to surfing websites that we don't allow, has been blocked. And as that threat score rises, you can get a report on some users that you might have to pay closer attention to. There's a standard content out of the box for those kind of things. And by the way, that threat score can be changed to fit your needs. The other thing is another user activity monitoring. By just putting in a full name, saying, show me all the activity based on all his IDs and roles in the environment in different systems and what he's done. So this is, full name is John Doe. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4 different IDs. You can see the Microsoft Exchange, Blue Coat, McAfee, PO, and just getting a full report of what the user is doing. Okay. Role violations. If you do have, a lot of people don't have roles in their ADs yet. Typically, people are still trying to roll out IDM systems and get role information in there. But if that's in the systems, a couple of things you can do is these are real-time dashboards in our system. It's to say someone from sales, the names, and the circles basically say how many times they've done it, have gone to the financial systems. Down here by employee type, full-time employee, Ford, Fairlane, went to the financial system. So visually seeing what they're doing in real time on a map as well. Suspicious activity monitoring. So a couple of times you'll see here, most SIMs will be able to do this. Tell you, hey, S. Struthers sent an email to a competitor, message was sent. The lightning bolt basically is a correlation rule. But what now you can do is basically add the identity information to see, is he in human resources, what system was he doing, what's his role, to get more information off of those systems. And finally, generate metrics based on role, attributes, or group memberships. So how many human resources employees are there, professional services? So you can get standard metrics that have nothing to do with security, but maybe something you guys want to keep track of internally based on your AD or your IDM system. For example, it's nice to know that you have 8 DBA roles, Windows administrator roles, things of that nature. This is you could probably get this out of your security systems and your Windows logs, but it's all in one place here because we're getting all the logs and tracking the session. So how do we do this? So the key thing we do is we go in, initially pull all the attributes, keep it in what's called an active list. And then we go to the different systems and assign a unique ID. So the 6s up there basically are the same person. So that unique ID gets added to the person. So for example, all these 5s is one single person. Now whenever we see a user with a 5, we can associate it back to their full name. Okay. The other key thing is user attributes. What are the full attributes here? And you notice the numbers next to the unique IDs? We're associating the attributes back to that unique ID. So now we can run reports based on unique IDs as well. So this is the status of an active full-time employee, full name John Public. The roles. Now this is the part where most people do not have in their AD systems. All the other information, it's by default in there if you decide to populate it. And the key thing people don't put roles in is there's not really much of a use for it unless you have an identity management system or a reporting system that can take advantage of it. So now we know that there's administrators and it's an information technology. And so this is a pretty quick presentation, but some of the final thoughts. You need the information in your identity management system for any SIM to take advantage of it. The other key thing is there's particular logs that are very important. The HCP logs, so we can keep track of the user session. If they're coming in from external, VPN, so we can get the IP address and the translated address, so we can associate that back to the section. OS logs, where are they logging into? Because if they're logging into a Windows system and using a shared account for web services, one of the things people ask for, I want to know who that shared ID was. If everyone's using the admin ID, how can I go back and say who was the person that actually used that admin ID, right? So OS logs and proxy logs for going out. Where is that person going? What's he surfing? Is he going to malware sites? Is he getting anything? Is he going to categories that we do not allow or trying to go there? And by having at least the basics of these logs, you can tie back some kind of attribute to that user. So even default basic attributes right out of the box of AD are very useful when you combine it with log information. Then the next step is you have to have the ability for the SIM tool to dynamically delete and add users onto that list. You don't want to have to manage that. You want rules to be able to manage that based on your policies. Okay? Ability to keep track of user sessions, I went through it. Hey, someone came in from a VPN. He got a translated address, which was a DHCP lease. We're going to keep track of him. We know he came in from a VPN. We know what his lease is, and we're going to keep it open. When he gets shut down, there's a termination, and whoever gets it next, their ID is associated to. Next thing is, where did he log into and what applications did he go to? By having all this, you get a full picture of what a user's been doing. Okay? Making investigations much easier. The last and final thing is, and this is where a lot of our customers find the most power, is information that has no ID at all in there, flow data. Now being able to associate the session back to the flow data to say, how much bandwidth is a department using, how much bandwidth is a user using, what countries are they going to, and then being able to get information from routers and switches that are maybe your border routers and being able to see what actual users are going through there has been pretty key for our customers. I've got plenty of time. Any questions on this? Or how it works, or Mike? No, you good? So there is a demo of this back table if you guys would like to see it, run down even deeper. But there's no questions, I think. Yeah?
How do you track what applications?
So basically it's logs. So for example, we have customers that are doing SAP, off the shelf or even custom applications. So if it's off the shelf custom, we pretty much have a connector that'll normalize those logs and bring it in. And then we keep track of that session based on where they went through, just like I was talking about. Now with custom applications, we've published out what's called a common event format. So if you write your logs in common event format, so if you look at the vendors out here, Damballa, FireEye, R2, they've already written their logs in ArcSiGht's common event format. So if those products are in your environment, we don't need to do anything. Their logs are already in our format. We don't need to create a connector for it. So it brings it in automatically.
So it's like a service that you would deploy and have your custom applications involved in the log.
Yeah, so one of our largest financial customers, they've standardized on all their financial logs or all their applications that they're writing in-house are written in CEF log format. So it's published, it's open source, so if you write it in that and you use ArcSight, you can get it in there. Other tools, for example, such as Splunk for log management, they've already wrote a connector that forwards their events out in Ceph format if you have our correlation engine, you want to use it to get the logs from there as well. So.
Yeah.
What devices do you get flow data from?
Right now it's JFlow and NetFlow, adding SFlow support later. So anything that has standard SFlow data, not just, standard NetFlow data, not just Cisco devices, for example, NetScout, ingenious products that do layer 7 analysis or flow data, those all support it. They also write their logs in CEF format as well. So.
Can you dump flow information from Arbor into a connector?
Yes, so we have an Arbor connector as well that brings in log data into the system. So.
When did that come out?
Those are my customers giving me a hard time right now. So. All right, great. If you have any questions, I'll be at the booth. I guess I used 10 minutes of my 30-minute time window. So if there's any questions, yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.